Picture a hillside on the eastern coast of New Zealand's South Island, the kind of rolling farmland that has been grazed by sheep for over a century, worn thin, tired, and increasingly abandoned by the families who once worked it. Now picture that hillside slowly disappearing under a thick, spiny, yellow-flowered wall of shrubbery that almost every farmer in the country considered an enemy. That is the scene Hugh Wilson walked into in 1987 when he bought a strip of that land on Banks Peninsula and made a decision that would puzzle his neighbors for years to come. The plant covering his new land was gorse, and New Zealand farmers had been fighting it for over a century. Everyone told Wilson the same thing when they saw what he had bought. Burn it, spray it, dig it out by the roots before it spreads any further. Gorse was public enemy number one across the country's hill country, hated so widely and for so long that it had been formally declared a noxious weed by an act of parliament all the way back in 1900. Hugh Wilson did none of the things his neighbors expected. He let it grow. What happened on that hillside over the following 4 decades would go on to change how ecologists think about invasive species entirely. And to understand why, we first need to understand exactly why this so-called worthless plant was so hated in the first place. Gorse is not native to New Zealand. European settlers brought it over in the early 1800s, mostly to plant as living hedgerows, a natural fence line to keep grazing livestock contained within their paddocks. Back home in Western Europe, where the plant originally comes from, this worked exactly as intended. Gorse there has natural enemies that keep it in check, insects that feed specifically on its seed pods, fungal pathogens that limit its growth, and a whole community of competing native plants that stop it from spreading unchecked. New Zealand had none of those natural checks in place. Without anything to hold it back, gorse spread far beyond the tidy hedgerows it had originally been planted in, marching steadily across the hill country that settlers had cleared for sheep and cattle grazing. By the time it was officially declared a noxious weed in 1900, gorse already covered vast stretches of productive farmland, and farmers had already been fighting a long, exhausting, largely losing battle against it for decades. It is not hard to understand why they hated it so intensely. The plant is armored from base to tip in sharp, rigid spines capable of tearing through work clothes and skin alike, making even walking through a gorse thicket a genuinely painful undertaking. It is also saturated with flammable oils, meaning a hillside covered in gorse burns hotter and faster than almost any other vegetation in the landscape, turning what might have been a small containable grass fire into a serious and fast-moving wildfire. And worst of all, from any working farmer's perspective, gorse is astonishingly difficult to permanently eliminate. Cut it down to a bare stump and it simply regrows, often thicker and more aggressive than before. Spray it with herbicide and a seed bank buried deep in the surrounding soil, capable of lying completely dormant for many decades, patiently waits its turn to replace whatever was just killed above ground. For most of the 20th century, the entire practical relationship New Zealanders had with gorse could be summed up in one single-minded, unified national goal: figure out how to kill it once and for all. And yet, a small number of ecologists, starting as early as the 1950s, began quietly noticing something that did not fit this narrative at all. If you left an old stand of gorse completely alone, genuinely alone, with no grazing animals nibbling down any fresh growth, no periodic burning, and no herbicide spraying, something distinctly unexpected began growing in the shadows underneath it. Native seedlings. Not more weeds crowding in typical fashion. Not simply more gorse expanding its own territory. The actual native trees and shrubs that had covered these same hills long before European settlers ever arrived with their sheep and their hedgerow seeds. A researcher named Druce documented this pattern carefully back in 1957, describing gorse thickets around 10 years of age that were already dense with native forest species, quietly establishing themselves in the shelter beneath the spiny canopy above. By the time that same patch of gorse reached 30 or 40 years old, those young native plants had grown tall enough to shade out the gorse entirely from above, and the gorse died back on its own terms, essentially collapsing under the weight of the very forest canopy it had unknowingly helped raise from seed. Ecologists eventually settled on a specific name for this exact phenomenon: a nurse crop. The very plant that generations of farmers had considered entirely worthless was, under the right conditions and given enough uninterrupted time, quietly performing something very close to a forest's early childcare. Here is why this actually works, at a biological level. Gorse belongs to the pea family, technically making it a legume, closely related to garden peas and to common clover. Like other legumes, gorse hosts colonies of nitrogen-fixing bacteria living inside small nodules on its own root system. And those bacteria pull nitrogen gas directly out of the surrounding air and convert it into a chemical form that plants can actually absorb and use, effectively fertilizing the soil it grows in for free, with no farmer or fertilizer bag required. Its extremely dense, spiny canopy provides a second, equally important benefit. It physically excludes grazing animals, who understandably avoid pushing their way through a solid wall of sharp thorns to reach anything growing underneath. And it also blocks harsh prevailing wind and damaging frost, creating a sheltered, shaded, noticeably milder microclimate directly beneath the canopy. For a tiny, shade-tolerant native seedling that has just germinated from a wind-blown or bird-carried seed, that pocket of shelter is precisely the head start it needs to survive its first few genuinely fragile years of life, years during which it would otherwise be fully exposed, entirely unprotected, and extremely vulnerable to being eaten or frozen out before it ever had a real chance. This was the underlying science Hugh Wilson was almost certainly relying on, whether or not he ever stated it to anyone in those exact technical terms, when he made his decision back in 1987. He named the land Hinewai Reserve, and rather than managing the gorse the way every single neighboring farm in the district managed it, he chose to do almost nothing at all. He removed the grazing animals that had kept the land locked in a permanent, artificially stalled state, and then he simply stepped back and let ecological succession proceed on its own timeline, rather than his. For the first several years, the hillsides of Hinewai simply looked like more gorse, spreading and thickening in exactly the same way it always had on every other unmanaged hillside nearby. Some neighboring farmers reportedly assumed Wilson had thrown his money away on land he was actively letting go to complete ruin, watching what had once been usable farmland seemingly vanish under an ever-expanding wall of yellow flowers and thorns. But underneath that unbroken canopy, exactly what Druce had documented decades earlier on other sites began happening again, on this specific hillside, under this specific botanist's patient, hands-off supervision. Small, shade-loving native trees, species such as maho and poroporo, were quietly germinating in the shelter that the gorse canopy provided above them, protected from wind, from frost, and from the grazing animals that were no longer present to eat any new growth back down to nothing. Within roughly 10 years, the older gorse stems began weakening structurally and collapsing under their own accumulated weight. Gaps started opening up in what had, until then, been a solid, unbroken wall of canopy. And in those newly opened gaps, the native seedlings that had been quietly waiting in the shade for their moment for years finally surged upward toward the light that was now reaching the forest floor for the first time. Today, Hinewai Reserve covers more than 1,600 hectares of Banks Peninsula, and large sections of it have completed the entire transition, moving from bare, worn-out farmland through a dense phase of pure gorse to genuine, young native broadleaf forest, all without a single application of herbicide anywhere on the property. In some parts of the reserve, the shift from gorse-dominated cover to forest-dominated cover happened in as little as 15 to 20 years, a pace considerably faster than the alternative successional path in which native forest has to gradually re-establish itself through slower-growing native scrub species instead, without any nurse crop shortcut available to speed the process along. Here is where this particular story becomes genuinely more interesting than a simple, tidy tale of a hated weed secretly turning out to be good all along. Later research directly compared forests that had regenerated by passing through a gorse phase with forests that had regenerated instead through native scrub species such as canuka. These two paths, it turns out, do not lead to identical ecological destinations. Studies conducted in the area around Nelson found that soil microbial life, insect communities, and even bird activity differed measurably between forests with a gorse origin and forests with a canopy origin, which means gorse is not simply functioning as a faster shortcut toward one single universal version of authentic native forest. It appears to be shaping a genuinely distinct ecological pathway of its own, one whose long-term outcomes remain not fully understood even by the scientists who have spent decades directly studying these very hillsides. That finding complicates the tidy, feel-good version of this story, and honestly, it probably should. Gorse is not exactly cast as a hero in this story, but it is not really a villain either. It is simply a foreign plant that, once the specific human and animal pressures which had been keeping it artificially dominant on the landscape were finally removed, ended up functioning as biological scaffolding for a forest that eventually no longer needed that scaffolding at all, once it had finished the job of growing. Hinewai's story has since become something of a reference point within a much broader conversation happening across modern conservation science. The growing idea that sometimes the fastest, realistic way to rebuild a damaged ecosystem is not to spend limited resources fighting the invasive species currently covering it, but instead to identify and remove whatever specific pressures are keeping that ecosystem artificially stalled in the first place. The grazing, the burning, the constant spraying, and then to simply let ecological succession finish a job it was arguably already fully capable of completing on its own, given enough patience and enough uninterrupted time. That does not mean every invasive plant found anywhere on the planet automatically deserves this same degree of patience, and it would be a mistake to draw that broader conclusion from this one hillside. Gorse works specifically as a nurse crop here because native seed sources happen to be located nearby, and because certain shade-tolerant native seedlings were biologically capable of successfully establishing underneath its particular canopy in the first place. Plenty of other invasive species around the world simply outcompete everything growing near them indefinitely, and never step aside to make room for anything else to take their place. The real lesson to take from Hinewai is not that invasive species are secretly good for ecosystems in general. It is a narrower lesson, and honestly, a considerably more useful one. Ecosystems recover in distinct sequential stages, and sometimes the exact stage that looks the most like outright failure to an untrained outside observer, a hillside fully choked in thorny yellow weeds, is actually the stage quietly doing the single most essential work of all. Hugh Wilson still manages Hinewai Reserve today, many decades removed from that first stubborn decision to leave a widely hated weed alone, rather than spray it into oblivion the way every neighboring farm had. What began as one botanist's simple refusal to fight the gorse the way everyone around him insisted he should has since become one of New Zealand's most studied and most frequently cited examples of large-scale forest recovery in action, standing today as quiet, living proof that sometimes the single most effective conservation strategy available to us is simply knowing when not to intervene at all and trusting a natural process that was already quietly working long before any of us were there to name it or take credit for it. Hinewai is not actually the only place in the world where scientists have documented this exact pattern. Ecologists studying tropical forest recovery in parts of Puerto Rico have found strikingly similar dynamics playing out with fast-growing introduced trees that colonize abandoned farmland long before slower native species ever could, providing shade, suppressing aggressive grasses, and attracting seed-dispersing birds that carry native seeds in from surrounding forest fragments. In several of those studies, native tree diversity beneath these introduced pioneer species eventually rivaled or even exceeded the diversity found in comparable patches of old-growth forest nearby, once enough decades had passed. The specific plants differ from one region to the next, but the underlying mechanism tends to repeat itself. A hardy, fast-growing pioneer species colonizes damaged, open ground first, modifies the harsh microclimate at ground level, and in doing so quietly creates the exact conditions that slower, more sensitive native species need in order to get established at all. None of this makes the case that gorse, or any other introduced species, should simply be left unmanaged everywhere it appears. Context always matters enormously. Whether a nurse crop pathway like this one actually works depends heavily on how close intact native forest remains nearby to supply seed, on the specific animals that disperse those seeds moving through the landscape, and on how long anyone is realistically willing to wait for a slow, multi-decade process to fully play out on its own. What Hinewai offers is not a universal formula so much as a genuinely useful case study, one careful demonstration that the presence of a hated invasive species is not automatically the same thing as ecological failure, and that sometimes the more productive question is not simply, how do we destroy this plant, but what, if anything, might this plant be quietly doing for us right now, whether we intended it to or not? If a story like this one made you look at a patch of weeds a little differently, that is exactly the kind of thing this channel exists for. Subscribe if you want more real verified stories from the strange and surprising edges of the natural world, and I will see you in the next one.